In churches like ours, there is a long-standing tradition that we vote on our senior pastors. This is for good reason. Scripture gives many examples that lead us to the conclusion that pastors are to fill their offices by congregational election. While the New Testament never uses the modern language of voting, it consistently presents a pattern in which the congregation knows, evaluates, and recognizes the men who will shepherd them. The call to pastoral office is not something done in a corner, nor is it done and decided by a single leader. It is a relational calling rooted in the life of the local body, where the people who will be led participate in recognizing the man or men who will lead them. Throughout Scripture, the appointment of elders takes place in full view of the congregations that they will serve. When Paul and Barnabas appointed elders in every city in Acts 14:23, this act occurred within the gathered body. The language used in this passage strongly suggests a public, participatory recognition, not a private transaction. The early church understood that elders were shepherds of a particular flock, and therefore the flock needed to recognize and receive them as such. The appointment of pastors was not something imposed upon the church, it was something done among the church as the church recognized its men. This is further reinforced by the qualifications Paul lays out for pastors. We get those qualifications in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. These qualifications are not private or hidden traits. They are observable within communal life. A man must be, among other things, above reproach, a faithful husband, a sober and self-controlled man, apt to teach, someone with a proven reputation both inside and outside the church. Those who are called to evaluate these qualifications are not distant officials, but people who actually know the man's life. The very nature of these qualifications assumes congregational awareness and congregational judgment. A church cannot obey these passages about qualifications unless the church itself plays a role in evaluating and affirming the man who would serve in those roles. A vote, then, is the natural expression of this biblical responsibility. In fact, pastoral authority in the New Testament is also a relational idea. It's not authoritarian. Hebrews 13:17 commands believers to obey your leaders and submit to them. But such a submission assumes the church recognizes who their leaders are. A pastor is not a foreman assigned by headquarters. He is a shepherd received by a flock and told to not lord over it. Congregational affirmation ensures that the relationship between pastor and people is entered into willingly and transparently by the pastor and the congregation with mutual accountability and spiritual trust. If the congregation is just commanded to follow the pastor, it necessarily leads to all kinds and manners of problems. But a congregation involved in the process will recognize how holy this is as they themselves are on their knees praying. Even Peter's instructions to elders reinforce this very idea. He commands pastors not to be domineering over those in your charge. That's 1 Peter 5, verse 3. A command that makes sense only in the context where pastoral authority is recognized by the congregation. The congregation receives and affirms its shepherds, and the shepherds serve willingly and humbly. Modern congregational voting, then, protects this New Testament pattern by ensuring that authority in the church is never seized, it's never assumed, it's never imposed. Instead, it is recognized by the church for the good of the church. For these reasons, congregational affirmation of pastors is not merely a tradition that we have as Baptists. It is a biblically rooted practice. It respects the relational nature of pastoral ministry, and it honors the observable qualifications Scripture gives while reflecting the early church's pattern of publicly recognizing local shepherds. Whether calling a senior pastor or bringing on additional pastors, I would argue the same biblical principle applies today. If a man will shepherd the flock, then the flock should recognize him as their shepherd. Congregational voting is simply the formal expression of a timeless biblical reality. God calls pastors, but God's people confirm the men God has called. Which leads to a question for today's Ask the Pastor. We know we vote for our senior pastor, but why should we vote for assistant pastors? I would say if Scripture gives us clear principles that support congregational affirmation of pastors, then an obvious question rises. Why do churches like ours vote on senior pastors, but sometimes in our Baptist circles not vote on assistant pastors? After all, we call both pastors. Both preach, both shepherd, both are to meet biblical qualifications for leadership, both exercise spiritual leadership. Logically, the practice of voting for one group and not the other sits uneasily beside our theology. It feels inconsistent. And that's because, in many ways, it is inconsistent. The history behind this pattern is simple. Many churches have developed the role of assistant pastor as an administrative or supportive position functioning under the senior pastor. The title pastor was attached to that role somewhat loosely, often out of courtesy, sometimes out of practicality, while the church still treated the senior pastor as the true spiritual authority. In this kind of church structure, assistant pastors are viewed more like staff members hired to help the senior pastor fulfill his vision. But over time, as our theology has sharpened and our ecclesiology has matured, we have rightly recognized that the Bible knows nothing of two categories of pastors, senior pastors and staff pastors. According to Scripture, pastors are pastors, elders are elders, shepherds are shepherds, and the office is singular, even if the roles may vary within the congregation. This is why our current practice feels a bit strained. If an assistant pastor is truly a pastor biblically, if he meets the qualifications of 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, if he is entrusted with preaching, teaching, counseling, and shepherding, then it follows that the congregation should have a voice in affirming him. The New Testament pattern of public recognition, congregational awareness of character, and relational pastoral authority applies to him just as much as it applied to the senior pastor. Scripture never presents an elder who is accountable only upward to a senior pastor. Elders are always accountable to the Lord, to one another, and to the church that they serve. And because of this common modern model, it has created a contradiction. We call these men pastors, but we treat them functionally like employees. We expect our people to receive their spiritual leadership, but we do not invite our people to participate in their recognition. We assign them pastoral authority, but we do not submit their calling to the congregation's discernment. It is understandable why churches built with this structure are less efficient. Practically, administratively, they might be clean, but it does not match ecclesiology. It may not even match our own practice. And we could be honest about that, and should be. This is where churches like ours must take an honest, biblical step forward. If a man is going to shepherd the flock, then the flock should acknowledge him as their shepherd. If a man is going to preach the word, then the people who will be sitting under that preaching should affirm his calling. If we truly believe there is one office of pastor, then the process that brings a man into that office should not change simply because his title begins with assistant instead of senior. The title may differ, the responsibilities may differ, but the office of pastor should not. So why don't we vote on assistant pastors? Historically, it may be because our practice developed before our theology caught up. But we are no longer content to operate out of tradition alone, especially when that tradition conflicts with Scripture. If we want a church culture rooted in clarity and accountability and biblical leadership, then our processes must match our convictions. And when our convictions say that pastors should be affirmed by the congregation, then wisdom and consistency say that all pastors should be affirmed by the congregation. At Faith Baptist Church in Taylor, South Carolina, I'm thankful to pastor a congregation with a constitution that expressly states that assistant pastors should be voted on by the congregation. I believe in that document, but I believe it's bound by Scripture. However, I also recognize that a quiet shift has taken place towards senior pastor role. When one man appoints other pastors, the church is no longer congregational. It is functionally hierarchical. And history shows again and again that this shift does not stay quiet for long. It always grows, it always spreads, and eventually it often harms the church. This is why the diagnostic questions I'm about to ask are essential. If the church did not vote or affirm this man, is he actually a pastor? If the church did not recognize him, how did he get that office? If those questions cannot be answered biblically, something is wrong. And there are many historical examples of this kind of thing going astray. The early cracks we can see even in English congregationalism in the 1600s to 1700s. Congregational churches in England began with a firm conviction that congregations must affirm their pastors. But as some pastors grew in influence, a trend developed. Senior pastors quietly began hand-picking assistants without congregational approval. What followed? Well, assistant pastors increasingly functioned as pastors without ever being recognized as shepherds. Congregations grew passive, assuming the senior pastor knew best, and eventually, in some churches, the congregation's vote completely disappeared altogether in matters not even just pertaining to this one. Several historic Baptist congregations documented this drift in their church books, where assistant ministers were hired by the senior pastor and later introduced to the congregation as if the decision had already been made. Within a generation, congregations lost their authority to appoint pastors, which opened the door to doctrinal erosion and, in some cases, authoritarianism, where the senior pastor became the boss. Whenever the church relinquishes the right of recognition, someone else, usually the strongest person in the room, fills that void. And as far back as the 1600s, we see this true. We see this also even in 19th century Southern Baptist churches and the rise of what I'll call the pastoral patronage. In the 1800s, many Southern Baptist churches were firmly congregational and fiercely protective of pastoral accountability. Yet even in that strong era, a pattern emerged. Influential pastors in large churches began hiring associate ministers as their own authority. In several documented cases in the Southern Baptist churches during that time, these associates began preaching regularly. They were presented to the congregation as pastors on the pastoral staff. Yet the church had never examined them, the church never affirmed them or indicated any confidence in them, but their business cards still read pastor. Church minutes from that era record confusion. People were asking, is he a minister of our church or is he merely an employee? Does he have the authority to admonish members? Has he ever been called by the congregation? Is he ordained? Tensions grew when one of these unvoted associates ultimately succeeded a retiring pastor without a church vote. Some churches split, others limped along, unclear about leadership structure and who their pastor was. What was the lesson? Well, once a pastor can appoint pastors, the congregation loses the biblical mechanism for doctrinal and moral protection. They're no longer part of the process. But this is also true in fundamental churches in the mid-20th century. And this one especially is important because it's our lineage as Faith Baptist Church in Taylor, South Carolina. In the mid-1900s, as Baptist fundamentalist churches grew rapidly, many adopted corporate models of leadership. Senior pastors sometimes appointed youth pastors, music pastors, and assistant pastors simply by hiring them. Often these men preached and counseled and supervised ministries and exercised all manner of spiritual authority within that church. Yet in many cases, they had never been examined publicly. They had never given a testimony before the congregation. Some of these young men recently out of seminary had never been ordained. They had never been biblically affirmed by the church. In some cases, men were called pastor, again, long before any ordination. What happened? Well, the predictable happened, as it had happened as far back as the 1600s. A number of churches experienced doctrinal drift through the influence of unvetted assistant pastors. Others faced moral failures that the church felt responsible for, yet had never affirmed an individual to help them walk through it. Some senior pastors accumulated to themselves undue power because they strategically surrounded themselves with assistant pastors who were more loyal to them than they were to the congregation that they were meant to serve. This pattern became so common that older pastors in our movement began warning other new pastors, never let a pastor hire his own pastor. Here's the history in all of this. History shows that bypassing congregational affirmation almost always leads to blurred lines of authority, accountability, and responsibility. Dysfunction in elder-led but staff-appointed churches has been seen for years. Even in the last 25 years, numerous high-profile congregational churches have quietly drifted into functional staff-led hierarchies and have had a disastrous result as a result of that. A predictable pattern has appeared. A senior pastor hires a pastor for discipleship, a pastor for worship, a youth pastor. The congregation is told that the man is joining their pastoral staff after decisions has already been made. His pastoral status is assumed, not affirmed. Within a few years, this assistant pastor becomes very influential. And if he hasn't become very influential, he has become very loyal to his senior pastor. Two different things come up, and the pattern emerges. One, that now very influential assistant pastor becomes the one who begins to lead the direction of the church without the church ever having voted on him. Or, number two, tragically, the senior pastor has a moral or ethical failure, and the assistant pastor knows about it, but has no courage, no legs to stand on in order to really challenge him on this. When problems occur, no one knows who has the authority to correct him because he was never called by the congregation in the first place. And churches, in this history of cycles, routinely report, we never actually voted on him. We don't know if he has pastoral authority. He was hired and not recognized. He was counseling and teaching doctrine, but we never evaluated him. Some of these assistant pastors were just functional Sunday school teachers. In tragic cases, some extremely well known, this structure has contributed to abusive leadership cultures, failed accountability, moral scandal, and authoritarianism disguised as efficiency. The lesson? The structure you adopt determines the problems you inherit. A man cannot claim pastoral authority through payroll, but only through congregational recognition. And we need to finally be consistent about this. Why does this matter now more than ever? Well, for our congregation, we did just vote for a youth pastor, and so this question is well timed. But the issue is not merely theoretical. It affects the day-to-day life of our churches and the health of our leadership teams. In many congregations, we sometimes see patterns that deserve careful reflection. Youth pastors or ministry leaders are given pastoral responsibilities without congregational affirmation. It's confusing. Music or discipleship leaders function in pastoral roles without formally entering the office. Staff members occasionally preach or counsel in ways that carry pastoral authority without the church examining or affirming them in the least. Often these situations, I think, arise from good intentions, a desire to use gifted men in ministry. But they raise important questions, ones I've already asked. How do these men enter the office? Has the church recognized them? Are their responsibilities clear to the congregation? Addressing these questions, I want to let you know, is not about blame. It's about clarity, faithfulness, and obedience to Scripture. When we carefully recognize and affirm those serving as pastors, the office is honored, the men are protected, and the congregation can participate fully in the life of the church. When we skip these steps, even unintentionally, the office can gradually lose its weight and its clarity, taking time to confirm what even it is. But taking time to confirm pastors biblically strengthens both the leadership and the flock. Clarity in titles, clarity in calling. As we work through this very important question of how pastors should be affirmed in the life of the church, it's important to be clear and clear away any misunderstandings from the outset. I am not suggesting, as I close, that churches should stop hiring men to lead youth ministries and oversee music or manage administrative responsibilities, coordinate outreaches, or carry out the many vital roles that keep churches healthy. Churches need staff. Churches need gifted, godly leaders. None of that is the issue at hand. What is at issue is the title we attach to those roles. My argument is very simple. If you're going to call a man pastor, then he should enter that office the same way every other pastor enters it. The pastoral office is not a generic label. Words matter. It is a biblical role with biblical expectations, biblical qualifications, and a biblical means of recognizing that this man is called. If we are going to use the biblical word, then we should use the biblical process that goes with it. And here is where our own practice in Baptist churches actually argues for this point. If we paused long enough to think about how many churches do this, we can understand what I think I'm trying to make the point clear. Many churches hire a young man straight out of seminary, place him over the teen ministry, and immediately give him the title youth pastor. At that moment, the congregation has not examined him. They have not affirmed him. They don't know of his qualifications. They have not publicly recognized him as a shepherd, but the title is bestowed anyway, normally by the senior pastor. Then, after he has already been called pastor so-and-so for several years, the church finally ushers in an ordination council. But to what end? We've already called him pastor. We've already placed him in pastoral leadership. So what exactly is the ordination process anyways? What exactly are we affirming at that point? Our practice becomes muddled because the title was given before the biblical process took place. In other words, our own habits expose the inconsistency we've grown comfortable with. The New Testament recognizes only one pastoral office. Even though the roles and areas of office and oversight may differ in the size of the ministry, Scripture gives no category for regular pastors and assistant pastors who operate under different expectations. Elders are elders, shepherds are shepherds. If a man is going to shepherd the flock, if he will preach, teach, disciple, counsel, exercise spiritual oversight of any kind, then he should be affirmed by the congregation just like every other pastor. His character should be evaluated. His doctrine should be examined. His calling should be publicly recognized. Congregational affirmation is not just for senior pastors. It is for all who bear the biblical office and title of pastor. At the same time, none of this prevents a church from employing a skilled man in specialized positions, youth directors, music directors, administrators, counselors, or ministry coordinators. These roles are valuable and in some ways essential. But unless a man has gone through the same biblical and congregational process required of a senior pastor, the title pastor should not be attached to him. We do not honor him by awarding a title prematurely. In fact, the Bible warns us, lay hands suddenly on no man. We honor him by giving clarity to his role and clarity to the meaning of the pastoral office. Ultimately, this conversation, I think, is about integrity. Integrity in our language, integrity in our polity, and in our alignment with Scripture. The pastoral office carries weight, it carries authority, it carries accountability, and for that reason, it must always carry consistency. If we are going to use the title pastor, then we must preserve the biblical pathway by which a man becomes one. Anything less confuses the church, blurs biblical categories, and undermines the very clarity we say we believe in. Clarity in titles produces clarity in leadership, and clarity in leadership produces a healthier, stronger, more biblically faithful church, one that honors Christ in both its doctrine and its practice. Should churches vote for assistant pastors? My answer would be yes.